Hi, my name is Matthew Lindauer. I'm the coordinator for an organization called the Central Michigan Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, also known as Central Michigan CISMA by its shorter title. We are an organization that deal with, as the name implies, invasive species. So I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about the sort of things that this organization does, the reason why we're here, what invasive species are, and then give you some examples of how to identify a few different invasive species that are probably in your backyard right now as we speak. So, to circle back to what is an invasive species, the definition that we operate off of is any species that is non-native whose introduction is likely to cause harm to Michigan's economy, environment, or human health. So the really important thing to remember with both of those two aspects has to be non-native and it has to cause harm by being here. So there's a sliding scale of plants that might not be native but aren't necessarily causing harm, so those wouldn't be invasive species. Another example is poison ivy, which, as you probably already know, does cause harm in the sense that it gives you a rash, causes you to itch. People have a reaction to that, so it is causing harm, but it's a native plant, so there are things that will actually feed off of that, and it's serving a purpose here in the environment. What happens when invasive species are introduced is they tend to throw off the growing cycle in our natural areas so that the native species of plant really struggle to get the footing that they need to in order to survive and propagate. And so we see cycles in our forests break down a little bit. And what that will then cause when we start to see a lack of certain trees or plants, flowers in an area, we'll then see animal species that require those plants to survive. They will have to move someplace else or they will actually just die off. So we are trying to prevent that kind of breakdown in that cycle from happening by stepping in and mitigating some of these invasive species. So some of the ways that we do that is we're a grant-funded organization. At our core, we are funded through a grant through the DNR, the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, and that is what funds just general day-to-day activities for the CISMAs. There's 22 different CISMAs in the state, so we're not the only one. We're not looking after the whole state. In fact, the Central Michigan CISMA looks after the counties of Clare, Gladwin, Gratiot, Isabella, and Midland counties. So if you're seeing this, you're probably in one of those 5 counties, but if you're not, feel free to reach out, and we have resources available to point you in the right direction of the CISMA that you should be talking to alleviate some of your invasive species concerns. One of the issues that we see with invasive species is that they will take over an area in terms of ground coverage, and a lot of the invasive species that we deal with are capable of spreading and growing at a really rapid rate, especially compared to native plant species. So what will happen is, if we take a look just up above us here, we have a maple tree, which is great. We love our maple trees, but if we look down here, we have a whole bunch of buckthorn and autumn olive trees that are starting to grow, that have been growing for a little bit here, and I'll give some tips on identification in just a second. But what eventually is going to happen is that this maple tree is producing its little seeds, and those will fall down and those will get into the soil, and in a perfect world, if those seeds would be able to grow into a full-size maple tree. But because we have the introduction of this buckthorn and this autumn olive in this area, it is shading out and outcompeting those maple seeds for resources like water and soil nutrients, and certainly sunlight, because it's able to grow a little bit earlier in the spring. It'll get those leaves, and those leaves will shade out the little maple as it starts to come up out of the soil, and it will never get a chance to grow into a full-size tree. And therefore that breaks that growth cycle of the maples in this area of the woods. So what we have to do is get rid of the invasives like the autumn olive, like the buckthorn, so that that maple tree can produce those seeds, and that those seeds actually have a chance of growing into a full-size maple tree. So straight ahead is a phenomenon that I like to call the green wall. It is tough to really exemplify through pictures or video, but we're going to do our best. But if you look straight ahead on here, it is just green. You kind of hit a wall. There's not a ton of visibility. There's not a ton of space in between the trees. It's all this kind of medium height, brushy stuff, and that is, for the most part, a mix of buckthorn and autumn olive. So what happens when we encounter an area like this is we enact a treatment technique called forestry mowing. So I'm going to turn the camera around. You can see more of that, just that dense green stuff. And then this is an area that has been forestry mowed. So you can see in between these trees there's a lot of space, and that will allow new growth. So any existing seeds that are in the soil or that might fall, that gives them the chance to get that sunlight that they need and grow up into new trees. It's also very important to note that invasive species are great at continuing to grow and survive just based off of their root system that they might leave in the ground. So when you forestry mow an area like this, it's important to come back and do follow-up treatment, what we would call a foliar spray, which is an application of herbicide to the leaves of the plant. One of the favors that invasive species actually do for us is that they show up earlier in the spring than a lot of other plants. So that does give them a bit of an advantage in terms of establishing themselves, but that also means that they are up and about and able to be treated before a lot of other plants are, which cuts down on the chances of any cross-contamination or off-target herbicide treatment, which is kind of nice for us. If I'm able to, I will zoom in and show you. This is the mulch that gets left behind when you have a mowing project like this. So they're not as small as wood chips. They're pretty decent sized pieces, but it's a softer wood when we're talking buckthorn and autumn olive, and this will break down in just a few years. So this treatment here was actually done this most recent winter, and this is what it already looks like as far as breakdown and things coming back. We have some native grasses and some flowers were in here earlier in the season, but again, now that we're at the tail end of September, a lot of that stuff has gone away, so we're left looking at some of the mulch as opposed to a thick green carpet of grasses. But this is the effect of that forestry mowing. Again, getting that sunlight in there, getting some new growth, getting some native wildflowers and things that are coming back, even within that first year. So the earlier you can get started on treating your own invasives, the better off you will be. So in this particular area, we are dealing mostly with buckthorn and autumn olive and another plant called Japanese barberry that's in another area that I will show later on. But behind me, there's autumn olive and buckthorn right next to each other. So this is a little stem from an autumn olive tree, and I'll bring it a little bit closer. You can see some of the detail. But a few things to note if you are trying to identify autumn olive. The younger growth stems, like this one, the smaller ones, have kind of a copper color to them as opposed to a traditional gray or a brown like you'd see on a lot of other trees. The leaves on it, if you're looking at them from the top or from the front, if you will, pretty regular leafy green sort of color. But when you flip it over, it's much, much lighter on this side. I don't know how well the camera's going to pick it up, but they have a little bit of a shine or a shimmer to them, kind of a silvery quality. That is pretty unique to autumn olive plants. So if you see a medium-sized shrub, less than 20 feet tall or so, and you see copper color on the smaller branches, and you see the silver bits on the underside of the leaves, you're probably looking at autumn olive, especially if you see a whole bunch of it in the same area. Another thing to note with autumn olive, and a lot of invasive species actually, is that they tend to have thorns on them. If you can see this right here, that's just another stem on this technically with the leaf growing on it, but it grows to a point rather than just to a blunt end like a lot of other plants. So when you are handling this plant to get rid of it, that's really something that you should keep in mind. So you want to wear gloves and proper protective gear with this. Another thing to note on the leaves, it's getting a little bit later in the season, so they're kind of wavy along the edges, but for the most part, when you see an autumn olive plant, it's going to be what we would call complete on the margins. It's smooth margins. So again, this looks a little bit wavy, but you know how a maple tree has those jagged edges to it, really big defined kind of lobes. This doesn't have that. So if you look at the edge and it's smooth around the edges, another sign that you're probably looking at autumn olive. So plain green from the front or from the top, silvery on the underside, copper color on the younger growth stems and branches. About this time of year, we'll also start growing little red berries about the size of a Tic Tac. They also kind of have that silver sheen to them. Here is buckthorn. Now this is one of two types of buckthorn. This is called common buckthorn. Unlike the autumn olive, if you look at the edges of the leaf here, it does have some slight serration to it. It has toothed margins, we call that. So this is common buckthorn. If you take a look at the way that this leaf grows, sometimes they're a nice round circular shape, sometimes they're a little bit longer and more oval in shape as opposed to more circular here. But again, tooth margins, and if you look at that center, there's that center line going down, and then these lines that split off from it curve out and mostly up. So the other version of buckthorn is called glossy buckthorn. We can probably get our hands on some of that to show you, but it does not have tooth margins, and the lines coming out from the central point here on the leaf come out to the sides rather than up towards the top. This will also get berries. This time of year, they're probably a pretty dark purple or black looking berries, but they start off as kind of a lightish green to reddish, and then again, right before they're getting ready to fall, they get a nice deep purple or black color to them. So this is common buckthorn. This will also have thorns along the stem here and there, similar to the autumn olive, in that they just are more pointed stems than traditional thorns. But there's an up-close view of this, so I'll zoom the camera out in just a moment and we can get a look at some of the full-sized ones as opposed to just a close-up of the stems. Here we actually have a really young patch of glossy buckthorn. So we've seen almost exclusively common buckthorn and autumn olive today, but I'm going to show you some of the ways to identify glossy buckthorn. So, as you can see, leaf shape, it is kind of a circular, or I guess more accurately an oval or ovoid shape. And again, there's that center line, and then the veins coming off of that on the leaf go kind of up into the side. They don't curve straight up quite as aggressively as common buckthorn does. But if you peel off one of the leaves, don't feel too bad for it. You look how it kind of has that glossy appearance, a little bit of a shimmer to it, hence the name glossy buckthorn. But you can tell it has really defined and deeper lines on the leaf than the common buckthorn does. And the margins, again, those edges are smooth as opposed to toothed. So otherwise very similar in appearance. It has that same grayish brown bark with the lighter spots or marks on it, and it will also get those dark berries when it starts to produce those. Okay, we are going to talk about Japanese barberry really quickly. I wasn't expecting to see it out here in the area of the trails that I'm at, but here it is, kind of a happy accident. So, something to note with this plant, it's actually really popular as far as a landscaping and gardening plant. It's still widely available for purchase at a lot of places, which is disheartening because of the impact that it's having on the environment. But here it is growing. I'm not sure how it got here. There are some others in this area, so probably just a bird ate the seed and it came out in the droppings and landed here. But a few things to note about Japanese barberry is it is actually a haven for ticks. So they've done some studies that have shown that when you see an increase in Japanese barberry populations, you will see an increase also in tick populations. They like to live on this plant. The way that the leaf structure grows and that kind of close, dense style creates an extra humid microclimate within the plant, causing it to be an ideal host plant for ticks. So if you're not a fan of ticks, even more incentive to get rid of this particular plant. It also has thorns, but unlike the buckthorn and autumn olive, they're not big stemmy type thorns. They are tiny hypodermic needle style thorns. They come to a very fine point, and like any thorn, it hurts when you get jabbed with them. Something to also note on this plant is the coloration of the leaves. A lot of time you will see this plant and it will just be kind of a traditional green color, but you can see now that it's fall, some of the leaves towards the middle of the plant are taking on kind of a reddish purplish color. That will continue throughout the fall to change into that darker color until the whole plant looks a little bit purple. But in some cases, they have a purple or an orange color all year round. And in other cases, fall will come around and they won't get that color change on the leaves. They'll just kind of wither away and fall off so they can grow back again next year. So there's a lot of variety within the colors and patterns on this plant in terms of how and when it grows and the color that it might display at a certain time. Here it is, some Japanese barberry with some of those telltale berries on it. So they get a bright red or kind of reddish orange appearance. So we've been talking about a few different ways to identify buckthorn and autumn olive predominantly, with a little bit of talk of Japanese barberry. But to give you some idea of the size of a fully grown patch that's been around for a handful of years, you can look right behind me. I'm standing in front of it to give you a bit of scale, but it's probably 10, 12 feet tall. But this way there's a shot of it with everything in kind of from the ground up to the top of it. I'll get back behind the camera in just a second and zoom in on a few different things. I've got some to my left here that has a lot of the buckthorn berries growing on it to give you a better idea of what that looks like. But it's right here at the edge of a paved trail, and one of the things that you'll notice about invasive species is they like to be in what we would call disturbed areas, areas that have a lot of interaction from humans, whether it be people or vehicles. So the sides of hiking trails are a great place for it to be introduced. And part of that is just because it helps to press those seeds into the dirt and into the soil. But sometimes that is the method that it is introduced by entirely. So something that we encourage people to do is to clean off their shoes or equipment when they get done hiking in an area, especially before they move on to the next area. And what that does is it prevents those seeds from spreading, because those seeds are trapped in the dirt. That dirt gets trapped in the treads of your shoes, and then when that dirt or mud dries out, it's still holding onto those seeds and it crumbles out from your shoe. And if you have walked from one trail to a trail at a different location, you're introducing or spreading those seeds to a new spot. So important to keep your shoes and other equipment clean, especially when going from site to site. So also behind me is a dead tree. I'm not positive how much of it is in frame. I can see a little bit above me to my right. And that's actually a dead ash tree. That's maybe a story for another day with the emerald ash borer, perhaps for a later video. But again, just wanted to give you some greater idea of the size and scale. You can see it's just green all the way from the ground all the way on up, giving more reference to that green wall characteristic that we talked about when invasive species show up and really black out an area. It's super dense. You couldn't walk through there, so you can imagine what a challenge it is for larger wildlife like deer. It's pretty darn dense, so there's not a lot of spots for things to really make their way through, especially with the thorns. Here's another one I didn't really plan on talking about today, but I just happened to stumble upon it. That will actually happen a lot with invasive species. You'll find that they're kind of everywhere, but this one is called multiflora rose. There are some native wild roses, but the way to tell this one apart from the others is going to be, first of all, it grows a little bit more aggressively than your native roses. So if you see a whole area that's getting taken over by this plant, or by any rose plant, it probably indicates that it is multiflora rose, the invasive variety. What I'm going to try to do is break off one of the leaflets on this without getting jabbed by the thorns, because it does have some pretty serious thorns on it, like any other rose bush might. But I will try to show you a great way to find out if you're looking at the native or the invasive kind. So if you look at the base of the stem here where it attaches to the rest of the plant, you can see those little hair-like green, almost thorny bits. Those are only going to be present on the invasive variety of rose. So there is a very brief overview of some of the most common invasive species that we have in this area of the state. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or concerns regarding any of this, I encourage you to reach out with the contact information that should be on the screen now. Thank you so much.